Good evening and welcome. I'm Nicholas de Monchaux, the incoming head of architecture at MIT. I'm especially glad to be opening this event with our neighbors and collaborators at Harvard's GSD. I'll start my introduction, as we have all of our events at MIT Architecture this year, with a land acknowledgement that recognizes the physical spaces we are as yet partially occupying this year. So let me say that MIT acknowledges Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. At MIT, the land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Tonight, I'll expand this statement to include the acknowledgement recommended by Harvard University's Native Americans program, which is that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and all of us here tonight strive to honor this relationship. Now, these acknowledgements provide an essential reminder that democracy in America is an essential, but also an erratic and expanding experiment. From Native genocide and the Three-Fifths Compromise through the astonishingly recent enfranchisement of women and Black Americans to the challenges to full electoral participation today. We are in a democracy we are building, not one which has been already built. It is in this spirit that we convene tonight's discussion, and in this context, I'm particularly glad for the collaboration across our own institutional and cultural divisions that it represents. Now, the division between the GSD and MIT architecture, particularly against the scale of larger divisions facing a country, is a very low fence. But barriers of small differences can sometimes be the most distancing, and so all the more important to reach across. In this regard, let me extend my most profound personal thanks to Mark Lee, from whose generous welcome to me when I arrived in Cambridge this June came the idea for this event and other ongoing collaborations. And let me especially thank those two joining us from Harvard, Michelle Chang, Iman Fayyad, and Yasmin Vobis, and go on to introduce the panelists from our community at MIT, to whom I am so grateful for framing this discussion on all of our behalf. Azra Aksamija is a Sarajevo-born artist and architectural historian. She received degrees in architecture from the Technical University of Graz, Princeton University, and a PhD from the History, Theory, and Criticism section of the Aga Khan program at MIT. She currently teaches and advises across our department with a base in our Art, Culture, and Technology program. Her work considers the agency of architecture in political conflicts, including the role of architecture in the creation of nationalist extremism in the Balkans, the destruction of Bosnian democracy by architectural means, and the use of architecture in the construction of otherness and marginalization and oppression of minority groups in the US and Europe. Her practice considers the ways in which design can be used to deconstruct cultural bias, give voice to marginalized communities, and speak truth to power. Last month, her proposal was selected for the 19th Amendment Centennial Public Art Project on the Cambridge Common. Huma Gupta, a longtime member of our school community, is the current Newbar Junior Research Fellow at Brandeis University, where she's currently writing 2 books that deal with the political economy of architecture and urban development, The Architecture of Dispossession and Dwelling and the Wealth of Nations. She received her PhD in History, Theory, and Criticism from MIT this year, where she was a fellow in the Aga Khan program as well, before which she also obtained her master's in city planning at MIT's DUSP. As an activist and practitioner, she has worked on community-based monitoring of infrastructure projects across Afghanistan, municipal administration in Damascus, Syria, grassroots organizing around eviction prevention and housing justice here in Boston, and changing humanitarian policies for refugees and displaced persons around the world. Let me also say that Huma is renowned as an activist and contributor to our own MIT community and its civil society. Finally, Rafi Segal is an architect and associate professor of architecture and urbanism at MIT, where he directs our SMARCS urbanism program. Segal's past work includes A Civilian Occupation, The Politics of Israeli Architecture with Eyal Weitzman, which instigated a public debate on the political role and responsibility of the architect and the architectural profession in relation to state power and human rights. His award-winning proposal for Israel's National Library from 2012 and the subsequent ouster of his selection by the private funder of the project raised essential questions about the powers shaping the public. Siegel's work involves design and research on the architectural, urban, and regional scale, focused on how emerging notions of collectivity can impact architecture and the design of cities. He directs Future Urban Collectives, a design research lab at MIT that explores the relation between digital platforms and physical communities, asking how architecture and urbanism can support and scale cohabitation, co-production, and coexistence. Now, as a bridge to Mark's own introduction, I'd return to where we began. Land acknowledgements, while valuable, are also in their own way useless if they do not lead beyond reflection into action, which takes us to architecture as an essential part of the story. In 1630, John Winthrop extended the lands of the original Massachusetts Bay Colony to include those now housing MIT and Harvard, declaring them, quote, taken and possessed as vacuum domicilium. That is to say that they were allegedly absent of architecture. But of course, these lands were full of buildings, the separate villages of native populations. It was only in the early maps and drawings of the colony that the dwellings of native people were deliberately omitted, which, especially in the meeting of two storied schools of architecture, is a proper reminder that it is not just what we build, not just what we say, but also what we draw and make that is never neutral in this crucial conversation. And while anything we discuss tonight will never do justice to the scale and urgency of this larger topic, I would again extend my profound gratitude to our co-hosts at Harvard and our panelists for embracing the value of our continuing efforts regardless. Over to you, Mark, with many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicholas, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome all of you. As Nicholas has said, indeed, we live in a very divisive times today, and it's important to set aside divisions, and especially divisions between institutions. And I'm very happy that MIT's Department of Architecture and our department could jointly host this event together. And I hope this is but the first of many collaborations that we will continue to do together. Thinking about the title of this evening's event, The Architecture of Democracy, I'm reminded of a quote by Andy Warhol describing the door policy of Studio 54, the notorious nightclub from the late 70s, in which Warhol described it as a dictatorship at the door and a democracy inside. And it's a quote which I thought could also be used to describe the typical division between the production of architecture and the consumption of architecture, and raises questions about not only the pathway to democracy, but also the means of sustaining it. So at a time when there's so much uncertainty, particularly about this upcoming election, or at a time when many American architects feel compelled to vote and participate in other ways, I think Nicholas and I, we feel a need to have a platform to openly discuss this topic and the roles both architecture and architects can play in our democracy. So tonight, our panelists are not presenting themselves as experts on this subject, nor presenting architecture as a solution or an answer, but we're simply having an open-ended conversation. And as Nicholas has introduced Rafi, Azra, and Huma from MIT, I would like to introduce our three faculty members from our GSD side. And let's see, standing on the upper left-hand corner of the Zoom grid, weighing in at 105 pounds is the undisputed welterweight world champion in descriptive and analytical geometry, Iman Fayyad. But seriously, Iman is an architect and lecturer in our department, and besides being a champion on descriptive and analytical geometry and the role they play in shaping spaces, she was the inaugural Irving Fellow at the GSD. Prior to teaching with us, she taught at MIT and Princeton. She currently teaches in the core and undergraduate programs, and her work has been published in journals such as Log or Plot, and her work has been exhibited in venues such as Yale Art Gallery and the Carnegie Museum of Art. We also are joined by Michelle Chang. Michelle is the assistant professor in architecture. She is the founder of the independent practice Jaja Co. And she adopts an intermediate approach that encompasses building, film, installation, and music in her practice. And her research focuses on the techniques and histories of architectural representation. She has been a MacDowell Colony Fellow, a Wortham Fellow, and a recipient of the Architectural League Prize. Her work has been exhibited at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, the Mack Centers, Mackey Apartments, Rice University, among other venues. And lastly, we have Yasmine Vobis, also an assistant professor in architecture. She's the co-founder of the practice Ultra Modern, based in Rhode Island. It's an office committed to creating architecture and public spaces that play an important role in all aspects of urban life. They're the winners for the Chicago Lakefront Kiosk Competition and the Central Falls Affordable Housing Competition. Awards and recognition includes Architectural League Prize and the Architecture Magazine's R+D Award and Nick's Progressives. She is also a recipient of the Rome Prize, and prior to the GSD, Yasmin has taught at institutions such as Princeton, RISD, Cooper Union, and Brown University. So today, each participant will speak for about 3 to 5 minutes. We'll start with Iman, and followed by Rafi, Michelle, Azra, Yasmin, and Huma. Afterwards, we'll have a conversation between all the participants, and then Nicholas and I will host some of the questions that you have. So I encourage all the audience and guests, there's a Q&A function. Please type in your questions, and after the conversation or during the conversation, Nicholas and I will convey some of these questions to the participants. So on that note, I would pass it on to Iman.
Okay, thank you, Mark. No one has ever introduced me like that. And thank you, Nicholas, for co-hosting. All right, so I'd like to begin with a provocation by architectural historian Joan Ochman, who asks, what is democratic architecture? She argues, and I think I agree to some degree, that citizenship tends to find places of representations and enactment wherever it has to. In some ways, the political concept of democracy is difficult to translate into 3 dimensions, perhaps because the concept of democracy itself is so multiplicitous. So what does make architecture democratic and not merely egalitarian? Next slide, please. Architecture situates itself within a democratic society in ways that are both embodied in its form and function, but also irrespective of those things entirely. The first thing to humbly acknowledge, if I may, is that architecture cannot create democracy, nor can it prevent it solely on its own. Architecture can only go so far. In the end, the life of a republic rests in the hands of the people. Next slide. Architecture is not exactly a passive actor in our society either. Both the practice of architecture, as well as space itself, have the agency to facilitate and encourage democratic thinking and democratic behavior at various scales. As architects, our highest responsibility is to design for people. Our actions and decisions do make a difference. With respect to the process of design, democratic architecture is one that actively seeks out and mirrors society's wants and needs. The layout of office spaces and public libraries, proportions and shapes of school classrooms, or merely providing a space for people to gather, are opportunities to encourage free thinking and civic engagement. You'll notice, for example, as we see on the slide, that many of our government buildings, specifically the US and state capitals, were designed to have public plazas that extend from their base, providing a space for citizens to face their leaders and voice their grievances. Next slide. Next slide, please. Similar to space's ability to empower people, people also have the agency to imagine and recast space to serve a common purpose. This here is a drawing by Jacques-Louis David of the tennis court oath that marked a turning point in the French Revolution. On June 20th, 1789, the National Assembly convened in this arena and pledged not to separate and to reassemble wherever required until the Constitution of the kingdom is established. The tennis court, the physical space that allowed for this gathering to take place, is merely the backdrop. An active participant in the establishment of a new republic, albeit passive. Lastly, next slide, please. Perhaps one of building's most noble contributions to the mechanics of democratic society is when various buildings distributed around our cities and neighborhoods open their doors and give themselves over to the public. The day when architecture exercises its civic responsibility most overtly as an active agent in the democratic process is the day it is rendered invisible, willfully taking a back seat. Building function and program, at least on the ground plane, are almost entirely erased, flattened into a single adopted type, that of the civic space. whether school, nursing home, gymnasium, arena, library, or church, whether public or private, municipal or institutional, they are all just voting centers, distinguished not by their design and individuality, but by providing a space for a shared sense of purpose. There's so much that we can do to help our democracy endure and progress. As architects, we should involve communities in design, both in the process and in the product. As citizens, we should just go out and vote. Ultimately, the most humble thing architecture can do is know how and when to participate in the democratic process. And it can do it both actively and passively, as we'll see in the following presentations. But for now, in these next few days, as we're all going out to cast our ballots, whether in person or by mail, a conversation maybe for later this evening, let architecture exercise its humility and take a back seat. Thank you.
Good evening, good morning, good day. Next, please. I chose the title Architecture for Democracy. Seems to denote some awareness, a more proactive approach perhaps in the state of becoming, but yet architecture also does not operate alone. This assumes that architecture participates in our political system. And if this is the case, the architect, or let's say the discipline of architecture, has a social political responsibility. Not merely a question of what and where we build, but also through how we design. And here to clarify, my interest is in the profession of architecture and what architecture can contribute to democracy from within their capacity as designers, not merely as citizens. Next. Therefore, to ask, what is the role of architecture education? What is the role of design schools? Next. To broaden this discussion and to question the place of ethics, I'd like to quote Joseph Brodsky. The problem with those things, Brodsky says, religion, Catholicism, political ideology, etc., how shall I put it, is that in the final analysis, they are ethical issues. And ethics by itself can't keep society together. You need something else. And I think ethics can be easily faked. There is nothing easier than to fake high principles. I think in order to make society indeed survivable, you ought to give society aesthetics, because aesthetics can't be assimilated. That is, a man has to become an aesthetical being first. Aesthetics, you see, in my view, is the mother of ethics. Next. So in a way, we can say that aesthetics acts here to reveal and to expose who we are, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the environment, to society in large, etc., etc. Next. So my concluding points is, in order to serve and promote democratic values, we need to teach design. And design that allows diverse expressions and equal opportunities to contribute and to shape our public realm. It is through design that we shape our public realm. We participate in a public discussion, expose beliefs, discuss values, and form opinions. Next. The shaping of the public realm, the space of democratic participation, is our, as designers and architecture, is our contribution to society. Thank you.
Thanks for having me and thanks for being here. Next. In thinking about this event, I was contemplating the title, The Architecture of Democracy, and how the use of the preposition of might give a certain limiting frame to the way we might think of the two words on either ends. I immediately thought of this sign on the left. I moved to Houston in 2015 to teach at Rice. And these, what seemed like political signs were littered everywhere around the neighborhood near school. Stop Ashby High Rise, reminded me of the Ferris Bueller scene where it says Save Ferris, where a tall building was anthropomorphized to seem like an evil villain. And this came to mind because it made me think of the ways in which democratic values and democratic procedures are already happening in the everyday as a means for architects, designers, non-architects to engage our built environment. So that the democratic processes and the practices already existing in society are adopted within certain communities to change the way in which their urban fabric is evinced. So to me, these signs are discursive objects in the same way that, which reminded me of propaganda posters. On the right, you'll see a poster by Victor Slama from 1927 depicting urban housing project from Red Vienna, which evinces the materialized ideology of the Social Democrats at the time. The sign on the left in Houston was by Marshall Wilson, an architect local to Houston, who was against a 21-story residential block in a very nice residential neighborhood in Houston. Next slide, please. So what I'm fascinated by and the issues that I'm raising tonight are how can the myriad publics who are invested in our built environment start to interact with these democratic methods that exist, and how is it different in a kind of democratic society, how buildings get built or shut down because of these practices. In the case of the Ashby High Rise, the development was actually halted because of the campaign, because of the advocacy groups. Then the courts deemed that the project was actually legal, but because of so much political uproar, because of so much conflict, the site still sits empty today, many, many years later. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. You can switch to the first slide. Much has been written about the role of architecture in representing and symbolizing power structures, but how does architecture itself perform as a political actor? Next slide, please. Take, for example, the so-called spite houses, which we can find all across the world and across history. The one on the left is the Skinny House in Boston, the narrowest house in the city. The house was built as a result of a fight between two brothers over their shared inheritance. To spite his brother, who constructed a large house on their shared properties while he was in the army, one brother built the skinny house on the remaining piece of property just so to block the sunlight and ruin the view. We find similar acts of defiance in form of contemporary nail houses in China, when individual homeowners refuse to have their houses removed to make space for new developments. This architecture of defiance demonstrates how built forms perform as nonviolent actions. Basically, architecture based on its sheer presence and physicality offers tools for the oppressed to reclaim agency and justice in conflicts that might have already been lost. Next slide, please. Architecture gives form, visibility, and identity for minority groups. As such, it also represents an obstacle for various nationalists and white supremacists in creating their homogeneous national communities. Over the past 3 decades, the United States and Europe have seen a dramatic increase of Islamophobic sentiments, which often take shape in form of anti-mosque protests and attacks on architecture. You see here on the left a map that shows anti-mosque incidents in the United States since 2005. How many rejections to issue permits for the construction of new mosques that are justified by zoning arguments or concerns with an increased traffic, lack of parking, noise, or stylistic clashes are actually based on practical consideration rather than on pure Islamophobia? How can architecture provide a medium for minority groups to exercise their democratic rights to their religious worship if the same legal tools are deployed to prevent them from exercising these constitutional rights? Next. These mosque debates highlight architecture's role in politics of representation, but I would also like us to think about architecture's physical role in literally cementing structural inequalities on the ground. Suburbs and gated communities are often designed in a way that would prevent different social classes from getting in contact with one another. Why? These new soft tools of social and spatial exclusion, as I have learned from my colleague Dan Dioka from the GSD and his partners at the Interborough office, involve architectural branding in the form of lifestyle, which seems to have replaced the less comfortable tools based on race and class. If homelessness is skyrocketing in light of the pandemic, why are so many rich towns in the United States fighting the construction of affordable housing? And why are people who are experiencing homelessness across America 3 times more likely to be Black than white? Rather than criminalizing homelessness and increasing police funding, shouldn't housing be a human right? Next. The main thread of my contribution to our discussion today is the polemic between the stylistic versus performative aspects of architecture as an active actor in political processes. I would like to conclude with some thoughts on possibilities and limitations of both by exploring questions raised by the removal of Confederate monuments, statues of Christopher Columbus, and construction of new monuments to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The removal of monuments embodying colonialism, racism, and erasure of Black and Indigenous people can be seen as a powerful symbolic action to defy violence, racism, and oppression in history and in present. But what does their removal actually do to address the deep-rooted structural inequalities that perpetuate oppression on these people in our society? The construction of new monuments to celebrate achievements of the suffrage movement is an important acknowledgement to the long struggle of women's rights and responsibilities of citizenship. But what about Black and Indigenous women? How does figural representation provide a way into a complex history of suffrage and its messy legacy, while relevant to ongoing issues surrounding the struggle of social justice in this country? As important as celebrating the achievement for one marginalized group is also the acknowledgement of its contradictions and failures. How can monuments continue to include various voices omitted from the accepted historical narrative if they are built for longevity? Does the identity of the artist or the architect matter? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with this great group of panelists. Next slide, please. So I would like to put forward just a single image of Bryant Park in New York City as a means to talk about the role of public space in a democracy. What you're looking at here is a 1-year average of photographs collected every 10 minutes from a webcam for a full year between 2006 and 2007. So Bryant Park is a public space controlled by a private corporation. It's owned by the city, yet everything that happens in the park happens at the behest of the Bryant Park Corporation. The park is packed with events over the course of the year. So from corporate events to galas, ice skating, to the winter market, et cetera. And in fact, although we think of Bryant Park as a kind of premier New York public space, the Big Lawn functions as truly open and public for only a small percentage of the year. And in this kind of average view of the park over 1 year, specific events and temporary architectures disappear into the muddle of time. Tents, ice rink, occupants, and the lawn fade into one another. And strangely enough, in spite of its kind of constant programming and use, it is the space itself that reemerges in this final image, that the architectural boundaries are the only markers of stability. So it makes me think about a few things in relationship to the topic at hand tonight. That architecture can potentially frame physical space for representation. If we think of democracy as a physical practice, where making people visible happens with bodies and space, it seems that spaces and architectures are more essential than ever. Voids in cities, such as this one, whether they're parks, parking lots, streets, create a kind of critical slack that allows for a bottom-up approach to inhabiting the city. And even complicated spaces such as Bryant Park are essential for public exchange and for protest. And in fact, in 2020, this summer, peaceful protesters took over the space of the park to protest the death of George Floyd and others. So public space seems crucial, especially as more conversations move online and as we retreat more and more into our isolated contexts. So architecture's power in structuring the physical kind of everyday practice of democracy doesn't lie in its style or, as a kind of icon frozen in time. It really highlights the fact that democracy is a spatial practice that takes over specific spaces, often spaces of the everyday, and even spaces that were not intended for that purpose, to echo some of the comments made by other panelists tonight. The physical stuff, cities, space, bodies, they matter. But we also have to take a more nuanced approach to our read of public space as an active component in a democracy. We know all too well how some public spaces can exclude or be the space of policing. And let's not forget that this very image was created from photos taken by a webcam, which continuously surveils the space of Bryant Park. So it's both the physical space and the virtual space that can create and suppress the democratic process. I think for me, it brings up questions that are always at the heart of conversations about public space. Questions like who owns the space, who is it for and when, and who is welcome to participate. But I would say that these questions complicate, but do not negate the necessary physical presence of public space. Current events move very quickly. Architecture is slow, but I would advocate for taking the kind of long view on things. Thank you. I'd like to hand it over to Huma Gupta. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for having me here today. What can I say about the relationship between the profession of architecture and liberal representative democracy? This fragile practice of American democracy is only 232 years old. While the discipline of architecture dates back thousands of years, at first glance, this fact inspires in me a deep sense of awe for all those builders who came before us. But it also raises a concern of how the foundational myths of the discipline, whose aesthetics were forged within undemocratic economic and political systems, might encourage an ambivalent attitude towards inequality and injustice today. To prepare for this event, I began with Indra Cages McEwen's 2002 book, Vitruvius, Writing the Body of Architecture. I started with this because for hundreds of years, architecture schools taught the military engineer Vitruvius's 1st century BCE treatise as a foundational classical text that marked the formation of Western architecture as a discipline. McEwen argues, the birth of architectura as a clearly defined discipline appears to be codependent with the Roman project of world dominion. Vindicating its part in that project was Vitruvius's principal aim. She then asks, is architecture now a discipline unrelated to the imperial body in which Vitruvius rooted it? Has it ever been? If Vitruvius's was an architecture of empire, is what we have now an architecture of democracy. On my darker days when I walk around, sometimes all I see is an architecture of real estate speculation, or an architecture of caste hierarchies, or an architecture of dispossession. I think that McEwen's question points to a central anxiety in the discipline today. If what we practice and teach is in any way still tied to the older historical project of empire and domination, then how do we untether our architectural imagination and forge an aesthetic that is grounded in economic justice? How do we collectively organize as architectural workers and teachers? And more importantly, how do we stop thinking of ourselves as disempowered historical subjects who lack political agency? I don't believe that we are disempowered, but we are often made to feel so the moment we enter the university, partly because we are expected to spend our years living, breathing, eating, and excreting architecture. And this all-consuming culture of work continues into professional practice, which hardly leaves any time for our loved ones and certainly not enough time for politics. Despite these limitations, however, I have been deeply inspired by my fellow panelists and others at MIT, Harvard, and beyond who are committed to the unauthored and uncredited collaborative work of activism. The last portion of my provocation is a love letter to a few of them. I'll begin with the MIT chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects, NOMAS. They must have spent countless hours and attended 100 meetings through the summer in order to present a cogent and powerful list of demands to the department. And the department's willingness to consider these demands is a testament to the transformative power of protest and its ability to push change in the academe. While design and teaching can certainly be instruments of change, I think it is just as important to spend time improving the conditions in which we work and teach. That is precisely what the architecture lobby has been doing as they unionize architectural workers who have been relegated to precarious working conditions for far too long. One of their board members also happens to be MIT grad and University of Michigan professor Ana Maria Leon, who started the Settler Colonial Present, a research collaboration that investigates how the discipline remains a product, instrument, and memorial of settler colonialism. And then there are the GSD alumni, Elsa Hoover, Zoe Toledo, Heidi Brandau, and Jazz Bonanu, who started the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective just this past summer to promote design by and for Indigenous communities as being foundational to the history, theory, and practice of design fields. I'm also inspired by all the fall lecture series, for example, one curated by Cornell professor Samia Heni, MIT professor and head of Transmedia Storytelling Initiative Caroline Jones, and Barnard professor and former Harvard fellow Anuradha Iyer Siddiqui. Even more exciting were perhaps the conversations that began this summer through informal reading groups and the circulation of hundreds of open source syllabi. While some of us have been unlearning our own histories, others have put their bodies on the line, from Seattle to Boston, even to Beirut. MIT grads and Lebanese architects Ali Khudr and Rafat Majzoub spend their days designing and their nights occupying city squares in Beirut during the October Revolution. And MIT grad, the Armenian architect Garin Boghasian, who despite facing online harassment, continues to raise awareness about the atrocities taking place in Artsakh right now. I'm also grateful for the mentorship and activism of my advisor, Professor Nasser Rabat, who has spoken out against the Syrian regime at great personal cost. Another MIT Aga Khan grad, Zamir Basrai, and his brother started the successful firm, The Bus Ride, in Mumbai, India. Their firm has been repurposing the visual vocabulary of architectural design to write political manifestos that imagine a non-hierarchical future Indian state. I want to conclude with the words of CUNY professor and abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who described the way in which she grew up. Activism was our daily routine. I was raised to believe it was completely natural that no matter what one did, what one should be doing at the same time is changing the world. So this morning at 10 a.m., between responding to emails and writing this little talk, I attended a Cambridge City Council meeting with two fellow organizers who also happened to be Harvard undergrads. Collectively, we advocated for an expanded evictions moratorium, shutting down the housing courts, using hotels to shelter unhoused Cambridge residents during the pandemic, and the expropriation and transformation of vacant and abandoned public property for permanent housing. All of these people and many more give me reassurance that no matter what happens next week, we will continue to resist and we will persist. And I hope that even if thus far some of us have been too busy with work, overwhelmed by the pandemic, or feel unsure about what it means to be an activist or even to vote, that we try and join the ranks of these inspiring people and spend a portion of our lives being citizens who reshape the architecture and foundational myths of our democracy. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite the rest of the participants to join me for a discussion.
So I'll start off by asking a question back to all the panelists. I'm particularly grateful to Huma for bringing this conversation home to our own institutions and our own cultures of work and civic participation. And for that reason, maybe I can ask each of us to go around and reflect on the global questions that many of us spoke to and how they might also encourage a part of, I think, the process all of us are going through. Certainly we're going through at MIT of reconsidering and reimagining the actual institutions and democracy that we create in teaching architecture.
Yeah. Can you repeat that, Nicholas? Just
well,
the question.
I mean, I think in some ways, architectural education, I suppose, in the United States, starting at MIT in 1868 is technically younger than democracy, but as Huma told us, the culture of our profession is rooted in it may have been in Marx quote, dictatorship at the door goes way back. And it took a long time to get inside to spatialize that metaphor. And so given especially that our the culture of our institutions in the Beaux-Arts, my own father, when he was an architecture student at the University of Sydney in the 1950s, when the Beaux-Arts was still in session, was automatically required, as with all young students, to stand in the shower scrubbing the ink washes of senior students on their diploma drawings, not as a matter of choice, but as a matter of hazing and supposedly learning. The DNA of architecture and certain approaches to architectural education remain in our schools and in our profession, whether we like it or not, and along with all the other structural forms of oppression in our society that make itself evident in all of our institutions, this particular culture of architecture and architectural education remains. So we had this evening a bunch of really remarkable presentations, spatial metaphors, representations of space, provocations about the role of building in society. But again, I think the brave thing that Huma did was bring the conversation back to the spaces that we ourselves create. So my questions, I guess, first question to the panel before we go soon to the Q&A from the audience at large is how do and should we create and sustain democracy in the institutions and spaces we ourselves make, as well as, especially this evening, opining about these issues in the rest of the world.
You know, Nicholas, as a panelist is thinking about your question, I'm thinking about this culture of oppression, that has been, in architecture schools or in architecture education for many years that I think our generation or the generation before us has been trying to dismantle, So at this time I couldn't help but think a little bit about baseball, because yesterday the Los Angeles Dodgers just won the World Series after the first time in 32 years. So I've been thinking about Mark Edmondson, the English professor at UVA, who had been writing about how baseball is a metaphor of what US was, but football is what US has become. He talked about the rise of football over baseball coincided with a change in America's self-image from the first half to the second half of the 20th century. And he somehow made the parallel how before the Second World War, national game was baseball, which was skill-based, nonviolent, and leisurely. And it coincided with a period when the US was dragged into Europe in World War I and then Pearl Harbor, World War II. But then later on came Korea, Vietnam, or three wars in the Middle East. And it coincided with the rise in popularity of football, a much more warlike game, and something that's much more oppressive. And it somehow coincided with the change of self-image of perhaps a country as a warlike nation. I thought it's an interesting reflection, something of a larger, maybe national identity that could also be understood within the change in the identity of an institution or an architecture institution.
To bring, Nicholas, your points into the space in the democratic space, let's say, of an architecture school, I would say it is a question of what we teach, right? Of course, but also of how we teach. Now, questions that come to mind, do we teach students to be activists? Perhaps not directly, or should we? I hope teach or should teach students to engage in society. And there are many ways, not only protest, it's also support. And we do that through work. I would like that as designers. Do we expect students to work a lot and not have time to be active in society? Perhaps we're not the only profession that does that. Doctors, medical students work a lot. Musicians work nonstop. Should we release expectations there and encourage more engagement outside of school? Perhaps that as well. These are all things that we could say not only about architecture students. We could say that about other students. I'm looking for something more specific to our profession or our design capacity in terms of what can we practice, or how can we practice the teaching of design as a discipline that would further serve and promote values, democratic values. So the question is, what are democratic values? And I think this past few months, we primarily focused on diversity of who in society can contribute to society in a way, right? And that's been given an enormous push, I feel, on all fronts. And that is an aspect of democracy. So diversity, I would argue, is an important value of democracy.
Yeah, I would echo maybe some of the things that Rafi is saying. I think that, to become an architect and to function in this profession, but also within our democracy, requires an incredible curiosity in all things that we don't understand, people that we don't understand, traditions that we don't understand, especially given our pluralistic society. And so, there's been so much talk this summer about opening up the canon, the things that we look at in architecture classes. And I'm very excited about that project because I think in some ways it really challenges the way that we think about architecture. And I also just think it's a lot of fun to look at new things. And so how do we kind of incite that kind of curiosity in students to really kind of look at new things and also to go deep into those things? It's a challenge for sure. I'm facing this in a course I teach right now when we're starting to look at projects that are typically not looked at. There's not a lot of documentation, but I think the challenge is, how do you get people excited and curious enough that that this knowledge gradually builds up over time. This isn't something that happens overnight, but it's something that has to be kind of started now and kind of grows from there.
One thing that I agree very much with what you're saying, Yasmin, and I think that one thing that we're going back to the academy and what we teach. One thing that I feel like we don't talk so much about in school is what is the agency of the architect, and what is the sort of the extent, but also the limit of our voices when we go out there outside of school. And we often talk about the agency of the architect in terms of our control over the studio project we're working on and responding to a brief that we're given, that translates when we go out into the profession with, we're given a brief by a client or by a developer, et cetera. And so we're oftentimes kind of almost always responding to a question or responding to a provocation that is put forth. But in terms of sort of taking the agency of the architect, removing it from the abstract, and understanding how we can actually include and promote our voices in the process of the selection of projects, who gets to fund projects, how we choose projects to work on. I wonder where I teach in the core program, and we sort of, very first semester, kind of focus on, we say repeatedly, the tools and techniques of architecture, and we sort of build very incrementally from the sort of abstract or contextless into the more and more complex. But I wonder when in the design education, and why not sooner, do we talk about the agency of the architect in society, not necessarily just in the projects that we work on, but in society at large?
I wanted to connect to a point that was brought up earlier also on the kind of diversity as a keyword. Just had a discussion with our students last week about this word. We were reading about kind of administrative responses to racism and structural inequalities. And diversity comes up often as this, a kind of response and a problem-solving tool. But often, I think it's not enough to just come up with model of diversity. We should not neglect the deep-rooted inequalities, and just through a couple of hires and a couple of different perspectives, the deeper problems are not resolved. And I think, it's our obligation to have a kind of immediate but also long-term perspective on the problems we are facing. This has to do with immediate action. Yes, I'm really grateful to our students, both at MIT and at Harvard, who have pushed the faculty this year very hard to rethink hiring policies, to rethink, invitations to guest critics. They want to have different opinions and different people represented in our studios and crits. But I think, I personally, I've gone beyond my own zone of comfort and have started reading new things that I was not familiar with and had to educate myself. And students have been really helpful in that also, broadening our syllabi and reading list. But at the same time, the inequalities in this country start in the kindergarten. We have to build and help build up new generations. And I do think that, both of our institutions are occupying a huge portions of land in Cambridge and in Boston. We do have also obligations to these local communities to support, reach out, do something. We certainly have financial and intellectual means to share privilege, share access. How that might look like in the future, I'm really hopeful that the discussions that the students have initiated this year especially will lead us in that direction.
Yeah, I think that the issue of zone of comfort is such an important one, and a point of reflection right now. For me, thinking about the institution and how we participate in the larger topic for tonight, it's, I think of issues of time, theory, and practice. One, Rafi, I love the idea that one way of being generous as an institution is to give our students time. Meaning a certain pedagogical model might have to shift. I don't really know the implications of that, but the incredible power of free time for thinking and activism. Second theory, I always, I have this this sort of predilection. I always want more specificity. It's a real problem. But the topic of democracy, I think, needs political theory. I always have such trouble speaking generally. And if we take that seriously, what are we reading? Who are we reading? Do we have to shift from borrowing from certain disciplines of theory, moving towards others? And I think that would be an incredibly fascinating conversation. I myself studied politics as an undergrad and find that always a point of tension for myself. And lastly, models of practice. And I was just reading through some of the Q&A questions. I think one of the issues, or I think what can we as professors give to our students? And I think one is to offer other models of practice besides those that are commonly known to be the sort of ideals. Maybe that is to become an architectural critic. Maybe that's to work for the government. Maybe it's to start activist groups. But the tools we can lend and the sort of to project models for them, I think is another kind of generosity from the institution. I kind of, this is going back maybe to some of the presentations. I was really struck by some of the really architectural examples, I think, in Rafi's presentation, but also in Azra's presentation, where architecture is so physical, like the spite houses, that's really an architecture that becomes so inconvenient through its kind of physical presence. I don't know, I guess I'm wondering, I do feel like that's maybe one of architecture's central strengths, that we kind of can set up boundaries, right, and we can make things either accessible or make them incredibly inconvenient, depending on how we handle things.
I think in, responding to that, Yasmin, and to Michelle, it's probably easier to identify where architecture does not promote democratic values, or the opposite. And I think it's embedded in every architectural project, and definitely in every urban project, its political position. We're just not aware of it. I think reading and exposing ourselves to more theories, political theories, for example, and other, would enrich our discussion to the level that we can see the political significance, social significance of projects, which perhaps it's not that evident. But on the other example, let's say I come to Nicholas for next semester and I say, hey, I have a great idea for a design studio. I would like to do, a concentration camp. Yeah? The design, it has been done already, that would immediately, that's a very active architectural position, right? If I would want to do a studio that designs a concentration camp. So that would immediately raise a red flag. Oh, you're crossing a line, you're political. Okay, so maybe we take a step back and say, we would like to design some cages, and put them on the border. And that could be fine. But then, maybe can we design small cages with the small benches in them? So that also exposes, so the line is there. A political project is embedded in the architectural project. We just don't see it. The more we are informed, the more rich our discussion about all the aspects, the social political aspects of architecture, the more enriched that discussion could be, and the more informed that discussion could be.
Well, I would like to give in the spirit of Huma's presentation, give a shout out to my former Bay Area colleague, Rafael Sperry, who's in fact been trying for many, many, many years to get the AAA and other national architectural bodies to adopt an ethical code which would ban the design of death chambers and facilities for solitary confinement in the United States ineffectively. And if we can't start there, I wonder where we can start. But that also relates to, I think, some important questions that have been coming up in the Q&A, and maybe we can transition to that as well. There was a great prompt from Alexis Laporte about the importance of thinking of access. Berkeley, my former home, is also the home of the disability rights movement, and Ed Roberts, and the fundamental point that physical spaces need to be accessible to all. in order to allow full participation. And particularly in our pandemic, one of the largest tragedies has been the tragedy of the physically handicapped who are left unable, literally, to enter and engage public space by the way in which our institutions have failed them. But that also relates to another question which came to all of you from the Q&A, with which we might pull it back out again, which is, is there a way in which space or the design of physical space can operate that engages or produces democracy? My own example would be simple accessibility, but maybe there are some others as well. There were some great meditations on plan in Iman's presentation and some amazing physical spaces shown by Rafi. So maybe we can bring it back to the physical shape of buildings with that question.
I think the physical shape and the design, to Rafi's point, is really important beyond accessibility. I mean, I think just when we think about identity, the mosque debates that I was bringing up earlier, they are all about this what kind of symbols are people allowed to build and how to represent themselves, right? And in architecture, we have, at least in Western Europe, this debate is focused really on stylistic issues, kind of cube versus dome-shaped Ottoman inspired type of architecture, right? Then the Ottoman one seems to be representing traditional values, people living in a parallel society versus the flat roof kind of representing assimilation and conformity to Western European values. But, we might also ask, can the dome not be also something, that is Western European? So there are architects and buildings that manage to bridge both, that manage to create a kind of language that equally represents and does justice to providing form for identity of these specific communities, but at the same time signaling a kind of the arrival of this community and its integration in the dominant society. And that is usually something that is constituted by hybrid cultural forms that can speak simultaneously to different people in their own way. So design itself, I think, has a very important role to play, and it can mediate that, at least this debate on visibility and discussion, and it can take the argumentation out of the way from a kind of rejecting some of these symbols. And it can also have educative function. There are very successful projects of migrant communities in Europe that are kind of attracting people to come and visit and learn about different cultures because of the success of their design.
So in the question that Iman raised about the agency of architecture, the agency of an architect within the institution, within the school versus the agency once one is out in the profession, Recently, there was an open letter from Jack Herzog to David Chipperfield that was published in Domus about that architecture has a history of always being friends with power, So you're always subservient to those who commission you. Certainly one can say, well, you shouldn't design death chambers and such. So, but there are many things in between, So as a private citizen, one could think about being an activist or think about democratic procedures. I'm just curious how one could think of an architect as a professional. How can one work on something that is whether the brief is given to you or you're commissioned by someone else? And I think there was a question that was posed by Carolyn Jones about can we speak about architecture's complicity with real estate, which is personified by the developer in chief? So I was thinking in the same way Azra's examples of the Spite House. You have to be not only the designer of the house, but also the owner, the developer, the instigator of the project itself.
I was gonna say something about, I guess it straddles both these points, which is, the issue of accessibility and what makes architecture a civic space is not merely accessibility, it's all form of symbolic representation, as Azra mentioned, the dome has a certain attachment to the representation of shrines and temples and places of worship, which manifested themselves, early in our fraught democracy in places like the library at UVA, which is the voices that built it necessarily. But the form of the library has evolved over time to begin to assume other roles. But the other thing is in terms of ownership and developers, something that I'm really interested in that Yasmin brought up in her presentation, the POPs, the privately owned public space. Because at the end of the day, privately owned public space is owned not by the public. It serves the public, but it serves ultimately capitalist purposes. And even though those spaces are open to the public, they're not necessarily democratic. So there are restrictions on how free speech can be exercised in those spaces, for example. Like you're not allowed to be in a POPs space and use a megaphone to make statements. And Zuccotti Park, for example, which was the home of the Occupy movement, I think it was before this restriction was enforced in New York City in particular, but that the accessibility of the space is not necessarily the issue, it's who owns it and who determines what people can do with the space to make it democratic and not just public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add it's not only a question of ownership, it's also a question of the whole process of how, if there exist really public spaces in this country, are designed. And I would say an action would be to create real architectural competitions, which do not exist in this country, aside from a party space at PS1 or other, something that can't or a sculpture park here, or, but real architectural competitions that will allow equal opportunity for architects across to do significant work. And not the RFQs, which are based on more on a corporate model of your kind of past achievements and kind of money flow and all that. And there are models to look at from other countries. So this is a first step in changing the practice of how spaces are designed.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add to all of this, I think, in some ways, architecture always does feel a little tainted or compromised. I think like the Herzog-de piece that you referenced, Mark, that architecture is always somehow implicated with these systems of power and money and things like that. But I think that's also what makes practicing interesting, to kind of engage in discussions and to be at the table and to participate in those conversations. I think we have, I feel a very strong obligation to try and be part of those discussions. And I think, Rafi, you mentioned something earlier that in your presentation about shaping the public realm, but it's also about kind of, producing an architecture project. It's not just about producing the building, but it's also producing a discussion around that building. And I think, to me, that was very provocative and I think potentially very positive, that is a capacity that we as architects also have.
Mm-hmm. So there's lots of questions coming in, so I want to make sure we get to include them. I do want to give a brief shout out to the late architect of Trump Tower, who, according to his own professional ethics, actually refused to sign off on inaccurate assessments of the building's height and square footage involved in advertising. And so it is, our ethics happen at multiple scales, I guess was the point. They're important at the large scale, but also important on the short scale. There's a couple of questions just itself about the two ends of literacy and fame at the architectural scale. I was about 8 or 9 months ago in Nur-Sultan, the capital of Kazakhstan, which is a kind of architectural museum of starchitectural delights. And so there are a lot of questions coming up about the complicity of starchitects and well-known architects, not just with developers, but with governmental structures of significant repression. And then the converse question, I think, which is equally interesting to the audience, which is about the literacy of and about architecture on the public at large. Is this a relevant question? Is democratizing and understanding literacy around architecture a valid part of the debate? The questioner asks versus a kind of independent one. My webcam hijinks distracting from the question. Go ahead and answer it. If you have an answer.
Yeah, maybe I have an opinion about the second part, the issue of, I don't know if literacy is the right word, but yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And in my mind, maybe that was related to something, another thought I had that I previously expressed, that there are many models of engagement that we have as architects with the public to engage this issue of literacy, or whatever you want to call it, including going to community meetings, including making yard signs, including participating as an architect in political groups. And I think doing all those things as an architect is a way of producing that literacy without having to, let's say, engage your particular realm of influence, if that makes sense. And so, like, what was so disturbing to me about the yard signs in Houston was that the building itself, which was not great, I mean, it was a really terrible building, but became completely irrelevant to a kind of political NIMBY issue. And so I just think those more nuanced aspects of architecture, which I think maybe a lot of the questions queued up are asking, are incredibly instrumental for this issue of democracy. I mean, one of the previous questions I was thinking about, the sort of articulating the spaces. I think some of the questions get to that, like what makes a space better than another. I think a lot of questions are coming up, and I think what excites me the most about being a designer is articulating all of that so specifically. My thesis student last semester did a ton of research on protest spaces. And we were trying to, throughout the semester, differentiate public space versus something conducive to protest. And I think maybe even breaking down the conversations to certain aspects of democracy is also productive and instrumental.
I'm curious, did you guys find a difference between protest space and public space?
Well, so we came up with a bunch. Yeah, one of the things we looked at was the amount of time it takes cops to get to you. So circulation became as important as like the passive entry from certain particular points was one way in which we could sort of measure that. The other is, you know, the presence of like Instagram and filming, the degree to which surveillance actually helped a lot of protest spaces. So balconies, like something super simple, stacked balconies that you could look anonymous, but still film. So like shading, I mean, really, really basic things. So I found that to be quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. What I would add to that is that we can really understand the space just for its own qualities, but it has to always be read in context, right? In a way, from how quickly the police arrives to actually where is that space located, in what context, in what city, but also in what culture. So if we look at public spaces, for example, in certain societies, we don't find a middle scale as a space for a neighborhood to gather. We find gathering spaces on the domestic scale for the family, and then very large, massive kind of squares for the mass to gather. Now that non-existent of that middle scale, on the neighborhood scale, public space, or just a space of gathering, prevents the role of architecture in identity formation, which is critical in the city, right? The identity of a neighborhood helps the community form a presence as a political presence in the city, which then allows them to act onward. And there are societies that do not have that. There are cities that do not have that scale, and so are, in the cases that I'm thinking, are not democratic. So there is really a correlation, and it's an historical condition, between the spaces that we create in the city and the types of organizations that have happened in those places.
One of the first questions that was submitted was about if we see that augmented reality would play an important role with this integrated physical and digital space. I wonder if that has anything to do with what Michelle talked about in terms of these protest spaces, that it's beyond the physical space itself, the app and other means would come in to either increase or decrease accessibility.
Well, I mean, I think we were talking about I would connect that briefly to the future of schools itself. I mean, before I left the Bay Area, I did a last search for the word architect on LinkedIn. And as had been increasingly the case, any advertisements for positions as architects were swamped by advertisements for positions in software that were titled architects. And so the adoption of the language of our profession, especially as the hated verb to architect, is a kind of indicator of a larger transformation of space in our society, from the physical to the mediated, from the mediated to the networked. And there's an inevitable and documentable link between network spaces and political polarization, as we've experienced, and the lack of literal common space. You started out, Mark, by talking about the door and the democracy, but the club is itself, which is a kind of culture that permeates the architectural profession as well, is inherently a kind of reinforcing filter bubble of sameness and lack of difference. And so I don't know that the virtual is not, as maybe the questioner at least implied it, as we tend to think of it, a kind of decision with which to enter. Rather, it is the nature of the architecture itself that's around us that is increasingly virtualized and increasingly mediated, not as something like a sci-fi movie that we self-consciously turn on or go into, but as an increasing atmosphere and influence and role in public space and society. So as the former director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, I just had to go in there with that. But I would be very interested, particularly in the reflection of those who've been honestly spending more time in architecture schools, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, than I have, given that role at Berkeley, in thinking what responsibility in turn we have as makers of the physical environment to force, assume, encourage those sorts of physical actions and encounters between those who are different from us, which frankly doesn't tend to happen in mediated space nearly so much, partially as to pick up Yasmin's point, because the nature of digital space quintessentially is a privately owned public space.
We can't come up with any solutions tonight, you know? That's part of the premise, no solutions.
I think the correct maybe transition there is to actually celebrate the way in which this mediated digital space has allowed us to come together, a group of people who are right next to each other and don't talk to each other enough, and also to engage with the audience and all of the literally dozens and dozens and dozens of questions that we've not gotten to, as long with the some that we have. And I think the right spirit to end on is with all the unanswered questions that we haven't yet gotten to, and the hope that we'll go to them together. But I know I speak for all of our panelists tonight when I urge you, if you're in the United States and eligible, if you do nothing else as an architect in the next week, it would be to actually go and vote, if you haven't already, in the election in any way you choose. But the civic act itself is the most essential part of what we do. So maybe it's now 9 o'clock, and I'll thank so much, Mark, again, for the invitation to collaborate on this and other events, and particularly to all our panelists. This is a very difficult question, and to think about it amidst everything else we're doing in terms of teaching and working in our current moment was a burden for all of you that we're very grateful to you for taking up and sharing with us and with the world.
And thank the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.